Welcome to NarrativeNook audio tales where enchanted stories come to life. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe, like and share to support our channel. Enjoy listening. After heading home that night, Roxanne only told Lisa she needed to run an errand and asked her to take care of Archie and Benny. When she returned to her room, she bought the tickets for herself and Larry to take the plane early the next morning. Roxanne woke up the following morning and merely packed up her things before leaving for the airport. Once she stepped out of her house, Roxanne saw Larry waiting at the entrance. "I thought it might be inconvenient for you to drive. Therefore, I dropped by to pick you up." Then Larry opened his car door. With a simple thank you, Roxanne sat inside his car. Both of them chatted during the car ride. Roxanne suddenly recalled something and asked the man beside her out of curiosity. "Larry, I remembered you only stayed in Chania briefly before going abroad to work back then. How long is your stay this time?" Larry replied smilingly, "I originally planned to leave, but you should know why I didn't. It's because of my elder's surgery that my departure got delayed." It occurred to Roxanne that Larry did mention he intended to go overseas the last time they met. It was just that the elderly had been out of surgery and was recovering well according to his words. Nonetheless, Larry didn't mention anything about leaving the country. Instead, he had begun to participate in Chania's medical conference. Roxanne couldn't help but feel baffled. She asked persistently, "When do you plan on leaving this time?" "I'll see you off." Larry's brows furrowed slightly. "I'm not leaving." Roxanne appeared quite flabbergasted by his answer. "Why? Haven't you always liked the academic setting abroad? Moreover, you should be more accustomed to the research environment there." To her knowledge, Larry had always studied abroad ever since he entered the medical industry. "I wonder why he suddenly decided to stay this time." Larry's gaze turned gentle when he made eye contact with her. "It's mainly because of you." Roxanne couldn't help but be taken aback by his response. "After coming back this time, I discovered that the overall environment in Chania is very encouraging. For example, the specialists in the country cooperated well with you in the last surgery you performed. That's why I also plan to stay here to develop my career further for some time. If I can't blend in, I can always go aboard anytime," Larry tenderly explained to her. Roxanne inexplicably let out a sigh of relief upon listening to his statement. She inclined her head while smiling. "Since you're so remarkable, I guess many hospitals must be coveting you when you decided to remain in Chania to develop your career." Although Larry is young, he's already well known globally. Having him around is equivalent to having a renowned figure. "I bet numerous hospitals would be vying over him." Larry noncommittally replied while bobbing his head, "I've indeed received invitations from several hospitals, hoping I could work for them. The salary offered to me is rather handsome. Thus I'm considering their proposals. If you want to join one of the hospitals in Horrington, I might be able to offer some suggestions," Roxanne initiated. "In order to make plans for future collaboration, my research institute has recently done some investigation on a majority of the acclaimed hospitals in the city." Larry certainly wouldn't refuse her kind gesture. Right until the time they boarded the plane, both of them were discussing the reputable hospitals in Harrington. It was noon when their plane landed in Belridge. Right after they exited the airport, they immediately boarded the event organizer's car and arrived at a hotel where they would be staying. As the conference would only begin in the afternoon, there was still ample time for them to rest. After Roxanne returned to the country with Larry, they basically stayed in Harrington the entire time. Seeing that it was a rare opportunity for them to come to Belridge, she seized the chance to do shopping nearby the event venue since it wasn't time for lunch. After lunch, they returned to their respective hotel rooms to get ready for the conference in the afternoon. The conference officially began in the afternoon. Roxanne and Larry had arrived at the venue half an hour earlier. As Roxanne observed the people entering the venue, she could not help but grow increasingly apprehensive. Just as Larry had told her, the people who attended the event were all prominent figures in the medical field. Although she had never seen them in person, she had seen their pictures on multiple media sources reporting on medical issues. Larry brought her over to greet them. "You're Janet?" The moment one of the seniors realized that Roxanne was Janet, a look of doubt crept up his face. "A woman? More so this young." Janet had always maintained a mysterious appearance. Everyone only knew that she was Harvey's disciple. They did not expect that she was such a young female. As they stared at her, they could not help but doubt her. Roxanne could clearly see the suspicion in his eyes. However, as she had already been used to these sorts of gazes, she smiled nonchalantly and greeted him politely. Standing by the side, Larry turned to the man and smiled. "Don't be fooled by her youthful appearance. Even I am no match for her in certain aspects." As the man listened to Larry, his suspicions increased even more. He observed them with a weird look in his eyes and then smiled. "Since you brought her here, we'll take your word for it." Anyone could guess what he was thinking of by his reaction alone. Larry furrowed his brows and was about to say something when Roxanne interrupted. "Since everyone here is a prominent figure in the medical field, I trust that they will be able to make accurate judgments based on medical practice. Whether I am Janet or whether Janet can live up to her reputation or not, everyone can make their own deduction after the conference. Since these people are doubting me, I shall make sure to put on a good show later." Larry was slightly taken aback. Shortly after, he nodded and said, "You're right. I didn't think it through." The both of them then went back to take their seats. Soon, the conference started. It began with the leaders of Chania proposing a topic, and everyone would have the chance to speak according to their seating arrangement. When it was Roxanne's turn, everyone paid utmost attention to her. Roxanne stood up graciously and smiled at the crowd before stating her thoughts in a clear and concise manner. As the crowd listened to her, the suspicion in their eyes was soon replaced with admiration. Roxanne's expression remained unchanged as she voiced her thoughts. Once she was done, she bowed to the crowd and sat back down in. The next second, everyone started applauding. The leader who had proposed the topic looked at her with admiration from not far away. Roxanne again bowed slightly as a sign of courtesy. After a while, the conference officially ended. True to Roxanne's word, everyone present saw her in a different light. Every ounce of their previous skepticism had dissolved into nothingness. Roxanne, too, learned a lot from this conference. Although the leaders of the medical field were a little arrogant, they had achieved that title with their extensive knowledge. They had shared many different views on the topics discussed, which led Roxanne to think deeply about it. "I apologize for offending you earlier, Ms. Jarvis," the leader said to Roxanne just as she was about to leave her seat. There was a crowd following him as he came up to her. Roxanne quickly got up and walked over to meet the leader. "You're too polite, Mr. Lynch. I'm still so young. It's natural for the others to be doubtful of me. I've long heard of the famous Janet. Since you are finally able to show up at the conference, you must join us for dinner. It is wonderful to have such a brilliant addition to the medical field in Chania." The look of admiration in his eyes seemed to have increased tenfold. With such an amazing compliment from one of the leaders in the medical field, Roxanne was incredibly stunned. She did not dare to decline his offer and thus smiled as she accepted it. In Harrington, Lucian sent Estella to kindergarten earlier than usual the next morning after the unpleasant conversation with Roxanne the previous day. When he arrived at the kindergarten, there were only a few parents around the area. However, Roxanne was nowhere to be found. Estella obviously wanted to see her. She held on tightly to Lucian's hand, refusing to go into the kindergarten. Lucian frowned at her stubbornness. Even so, he could only stand outside the kindergarten together with her. It was after a long time that Archie and Benny showed up. This time, however, Roxanne was not the one who came with them. When Lucian noticed that, his eyebrows furrowed even more as he walked up to Lisa while holding Estella's hand. "Where's Miss Jarvis? Doesn't she usually drop Archie and Benny off at school?" Ever since they parted ways at the hospital, Lisa had never met Lucian again. She did not know that Roxanne and Lucian had got into an argument. Therefore, with the thought of them still having a good relationship with each other, Lisa smiled and answered, "Miss Jarvis has work today, so I came to drop them off." Lucian's gaze darkened as he heard that. "What a coincidence. We just met yesterday and she has work today. Is she trying to avoid me?" As Estella did not get to see Roxanne, she was a little dejected. She tugged on Lucian's finger as she looked at him in worry. Lucian patted her on the head before looking back at Lisa. "Where did she go? When is she coming back?" "I think she went to Belridge." "About her return?" "I'm not sure when she will come back. But I don't think she will be away for long." "Belridge? Why did she go there?" Lucian asked in confusion. Archie and Benny, who were still holding on to Lisa, felt angry at how Lucian was interrogating them about their mother. He was about to marry someone else anyway. There was no reason for him to care so much about Roxanne. With that thought in their minds, Archie and Benny replied with straight faces, "If you want to know that badly, call Mommy and ask her yourself." "We don't know either." Even if they did know, they would never tell him. Lucian frowned as he looked down at Archie and Benny. He was confused by their furious expressions. Even after thinking for a long time, he could not figure out what he had done wrong to anger the twins so much for them to have such prejudice against him. Or did Roxanne say something to them? Lucian's eyes darkened when he thought of that possibility. Although Lisa knew what Roxanne was doing, she hesitated when she noticed the twins' behavior. After a brief moment of hesitation, she did not tell Lucian but instead said, "We're not sure about that. But I saw a man who came to pick Ms. Jarvis up in the morning. I think they went there together." Lucian's expression hardened. "Do you know that man?" Lisa shook her head. She only worked for Roxanne for a short time and had only seen a few of her friends. However, she did remember what the man looked like. "I don't know him, but he looks like a well-educated gentleman. I think Ms. Jarvis addressed him as Larry. They should have known each other from school." Just as she finished speaking, Lisa suddenly felt a little pressured. Lucian's eyes had darkened suddenly as he thought about the call history on Roxanne's phone. There was only one Larry that he knew of, Larry Morrison. Moreover, Roxanne had given him a call yesterday morning. It could only be him. Once he realized that Roxanne had had a meal alone with Larry and had gone to Belridge together with him, Lucian felt extremely displeased. He then thanked Lisa and sent Estella off before going back into his car. When Lucian was back at the company, he went upstairs and found Caden standing at the entrance to the office. "Mr. Farwell." Caden hurried forward when he saw Lucian. Lucian frowned. "What's the matter?" Caden displayed a serious expression. "Some issues have arisen with our business in Belridge and we need to send an executive over there." "Who should we send?" "Belridge?" Lucian's gaze darkened. When he thought of Roxanne, who was currently in Belridge, he said coldly, "I'll go there myself." Caden was stunned. Your schedule today, things at Belridge were not so serious to demand Lucian's presence and involvement. Moreover, he had other events scheduled on this day. Lucian interrupted his assistant, "Buy the earliest flight tickets and postpone the rest of my meetings." Then he turned around and entered the elevator. Caden agreed to the orders and rescheduled Lucian's meetings as quickly as possible. After buying the flight tickets, he followed Lucian. It was already noon by the time they reached Belridge. The person in charge over here personally drove them to the hotel. Once they were at the hotel, the person in charge introduced the hotel to the two men eagerly. "This hotel is very famous in Belridge. A medical conference will also take place here today. I heard that the attendees are big shots in the medical field." Lucian returned a slight nod. Despite his lack of expression, his heart skipped a beat. After they settled down, Caden asked Lucian about the project. "Mr. Farwell, what's the best time to schedule a meeting with the person in charge in this place?" Lucian did not seem to hear his assistant and merely said, "Find out about the most recent medical conferences in Belridge. It's best if you could pinpoint the one attended by Larry." The person in charge's words reminded him that Roxan and Larry were both from the medical industry. Moreover, they possessed outstanding credentials, and there was a huge likelihood that they would be here for the medical conference. Naturally, Caden was oblivious to Lucian's thoughts. Thus he was taken aback when he heard this order. "Aren't we here to take care of our company's business? Why did he bring this up?" Still, he dared not ask so many questions when he saw Lucian's serious expression and agreed to the task. The search took him nearly an hour. Caden did not dawdle when he found what he was looking for. He returned to the hotel immediately and informed Lucian, "I've found it, Mr. Farwell. There's a medical conference this afternoon in this very hotel. Larry's name is also on the list, but..." Lucian frowned. "But what?" "The conference has already ended." Caden sounded a bit guilty. By the time he found out about this piece of information, it had been half an hour since the conference ended. He was unsure whether he had delayed Lucian's plan. "Were Larry and Roxan present?" Lucian asked coldly. Caden nodded. He had gone through the attendee list and the names of the two individuals were there. Lucian's expression hardened further as he observed Caden's nod. "Find out which hotel they are staying at." At this point, Caden knew what Lucian wanted to do. After a moment's hesitation, he said, "Mr. Farwell, they will have a gathering tonight and it's just nearby. I'm sure Mr. Morrison and Ms. Jarvis will be present." Lucian nodded. "In that case, let's meet Mr. Zimmerman of Prosperity Corporation at that restaurant tonight." Caden nodded in agreement and contacted the CEO's secretary to schedule the meeting. He was certain that the other party would not object to it. That night, Roxan and Larry attended the gathering, an event hosted by the organizing committee of the conference. It took place at a high-class restaurant known as Ocean Restaurant. The restaurant was situated near the hotel where the medical conference was held that same afternoon. The organizing committee had already booked a private room for the attendees in advance. As soon as Roxan and Larry entered the restaurant, a waiter led them upstairs to a room in a corner. The private rooms in this restaurant had varying designs and styles. The organizing committee had probably figured that they were academics and scholars. As such, the committee members had booked a room with classical and scholarly decor. As soon as Roxan and Larry stepped inside, a round table made of rosewood came into view. A flower vase was placed in the center of the table, which was surrounded by several rosewood chairs. The walls were also decorated with a number of paintings, making the entire room feel like a study. A few guests were already seated inside the room when Roxan and Larry arrived. They turned their attention to the two and regarded them with awe and admiration. Both Roxan and Larry were the youngest attendees of the conference. Although Roxan was a young woman, the seniors were impressed by her presentation at the conference. Roxan smiled at the crowd humbly. "Sorry for the long wait. We aren't familiar with this area." After the conference, she had gone for a walk in Belridge with Larry without letting someone from the organizing committee accompany them. Unexpectedly, they had lost their way back to the hotel and it had taken them a while to locate the building. "It's all right. Not everyone is here yet. Have a seat." Gerald, who was sitting in the head seat, stood up to wave at Roxan and Larry, gesturing for them to sit next to him. His reaction caught Roxan off guard. Gerald was an internationally renowned figure. Even Harvey had great respect for the man. Roxan never expected to be held in high regard by Gerald. She stole a glance at the rest of the people around her and realized that their gazes were filled with envy. "We'll sit near the doorway. It won't be convenient for all of you when the waiters come over with the dishes later, as she said. Then she sat down near the doorway with Larry. Gerald frowned, but he did not push it. That's very thoughtful of you too. Roxanne smiled but said nothing. Some time later everybody arrived. Miss Jarvis, you're such a young woman, yet you have outstanding credentials. You're a real talent. Everybody else began to heap praises on Roxanne after noticing Gerald's admiration for her and also witnessing her skills and talent themselves. Roxanne replied humbly, they were only questions brought up by Mr. Lynch. Coincidentally, I have researched those subjects before, so I'm familiar with them. Gerald even proposed, do you plan to work for my company, Ms. Jarvis? Just tell me what you want and I'll comply. The crowd was stunned by this remark. Even Larry could not believe his ears. It was obvious that Gerald intended to take Roxanne on as his mentee. Everybody else at the table knew it had been many years since Gerald last took on a mentee. Instead, he had been focusing on his own research wholeheartedly. The fact that he had made this proposal to Roxanne now came as a surprise to everyone. It took some time for Roxanne to regain her composure. She knew it was an honor when she saw the looks of encouragement on the faces around her. However, there was something else on her mind. I appreciate your kind offer, Mr. Lynch. However, I'm currently helping Professor Lambert with some projects, and I fear I won't be able to focus on this mentorship. I have to decline your offer. Roxanne apologized and rejected Gerald's proposal. The rest of the people were shocked to see her reject this opportunity. Gerald felt somewhat disappointed. In that case, I won't force you. Just approach me anytime if you change your mind. Roxanne returned an appreciative smile. Thank you, Mr. Lynch. Everyone at the dining table looked at Roxanne with more admiration. They even had the urge to take her in as their disciple. However, recalling that she had rejected even Gerald's offer, they felt embarrassed to speak up. Gerald quickly changed the topic, but the conversation still stayed within the medical field. Because of Roxanne's performance earlier in the afternoon, whenever Gerald raised new questions in the conversation, everyone would immediately turn their gazes to her. Roxanne felt as though she had joined another conference, with everyone placing the main focus on her. Fortunately for her, such an atmosphere did not last long. Gerald soon realized the atmosphere had turned a little too solemn for the occasion, so he quickly navigated the conversation to something more relaxing. Being the juniors among everyone else, Roxanne and Larry became their main targets to tease. Whenever a senior offered her drinks, Roxanne couldn't find an excuse to reject them. She would accept every drink her seniors gave her. After having several drinks in a row and noticing how her seniors still intended to give her more, Roxanne quickly made an excuse to go to the washroom when she was only finding an opportunity to leave the private room to get some fresh air. The restaurant was named Ocean Restaurant, and its decoration mainly was in dark blue with a touch of white, which gave the restaurant a mysterious yet calming atmosphere. After wandering around the door to the private room, Roxanne finally felt sober. She knew she couldn't make her seniors wait for too long, so she decided to head back inside the private room. Dr. Jarvis? Right after she turned around, she ran into a middle-aged man. His white shirt seemed a little too tight because of his beer belly, and the buttons on his shirt seemed as though they could pop at any moment. Also, the man's cheeks were flushed, indicating that he was drunk. Seeing that Roxanne had turned around to look at him, the middle-aged man took a couple of steps forward. He looked as if he was about to stick his face closer at Roxanne to confirm if he recognized her correctly. Roxanne frowned and stepped back, putting some distance between them before greeting, "Dr. Chambers, it's been a while." The middle-aged man was a doctor working in the hospital that was a partner of Roxanne's research institute. Roxanne had only met him several times before this, and aside from his last name Chambers, Roxanne knew nothing else about him. Seeing that he didn't mistake another person for her, he got bolder and looked at Roxanne in a perverted manner. I remember thinking you're beautiful when we met at the Research Institute. Dr. Jarvis, now that I've seen you out of your research lab coat, I realize that not only you're beautiful, but you also have a great body." As he spoke, he slowly approached Roxanne. "Look at your face. It's glowing. Let me touch it." Noticing that he had stretched out his greasy hand toward her, Roxanne felt disgusted and slapped his hand away. "Dr. Chambers, you should know your boundaries." He was startled for a couple of seconds before realizing she had slapped his hand away. He frowned and glared at her. "How dare you hit me?" Roxanne refused to dwell on this any longer with him, so she tried to make her way past him. However, he strode forward and blocked her path. "Are you trying to walk away from me after hitting me? As if I'll let that happen." After saying that, he shifted his gaze lower to her slender waist, and the anger in his eyes dissipated a little. "Spend the night with me and I'll forget what happened today. What do you say? If you dare come any closer to me, I'll call security," Roxanne warned, having been forced to a corner. He was unbothered as he tried to snake his arm around her waist. Greed and lust were written all over his face. "Sure. Call them if you don't mind. We can always let them watch us have fun." His body was about to cover hers, and Roxanne knew she was at a disadvantage if she tried to resist him with physical strength. As she racked her brains to come up with an escape plan, the stench of alcohol slowly filled her nostrils. Just when Roxanne was slowly getting into despair, she heard a grunt. In the next second, he was sent flying away from her. "Damn it! Who the hell is ruining my fun?" The doctor covered his waist in pain and scrambled to his feet. Before he could take a good look at the person standing before him, he was kicked again in the abdomen. That person kicked him so hard that he instantly broke into a cold sweat. He bent over and couldn't say a word for a long moment. Roxanne stared at the man who exuded a cold and indifferent aura before her, and she was startled. But then her heart was finally at ease at his presence. "Control your hand, or I will ask someone else to chop it off for you if you don't appreciate it enough." The person who had come to Roxanne's rescue was none other than Lucian. He was in his expensive customized suit, his hair combed to the back, revealing his sharp features. His thin lips were pursed and his eyes were filled with a ruthless glint. Dr. Chambers finally came to his senses. When he looked up again and noticed Lucian's expression, he understood Lucian was not making an empty threat, and his face immediately turned pale with fright. "This is a misunderstanding. I know Ms. Jarvis," he quickly explained. "I was wondering if Ms. Jarvis wanted to have a drink with me. That's all." After saying that, he looked at Roxanne pleadingly. Roxanne remembered his perverted face from earlier, and her expression turned cold. "I know him, but Dr. Chambers' actions earlier suggested that he wasn't only intending to buy me a drink." Seeing how Lucian's expression had turned gloomier after Roxanne said that, the doctor shuddered in fear. Meanwhile, noticing Lucian had not returned to the private room for a long time, Caden came out looking for him. That was when he saw the scene and quickly ran over to them. "Mr. Farwell." Lucian withdrew his gaze from the doctor and ordered coldly, "Take this guy away. Also, run a background check on him and teach him a lesson." Glancing at the doctor next to him, Caden lowered his head and nodded in response. The doctor's legs gave way, and he was practically dragged away by Caden. Roxanne and Lucian were left alone in the corridor. Staring at Lucian, who was still looking indifferent before her, Roxanne frowned slightly and got wary as she asked, "Why are you here?" She felt it was too much of a coincidence for him to be in the same place as her. Lucian did not answer her question but instead eyed her from head to toe. She was dressed in a formal suit with a collared shirt inside, making her look elegant yet at the same time mischievous. Her flared trousers highlighted her long legs, and her long hair stuck behind her ears gave more exposure to her fair neck. Under the light, she seemed to be glowing, perhaps it was because she had had several drinks before. A layer of mist had formed in her eyes. Her staring at him calmly with a slight wariness in her gaze made her look like a terrified deer. Lucian's gaze darkened a little when he took in her expression. There was no telling if it was the influence of alcohol, but her attempt to keep a distance from him made her look a little enticing to him. After waiting a long while and still not getting a response from him, Roxan pursed her lips and withdrew her gaze. "Mr. Farwell, thank you for helping me. If there's nothing else, I will excuse myself now. My seniors are still waiting for me." She was about to walk past him after saying that. Just when she brushed past his shoulders, she heard Lucian saying, "Miss Jarvis, I hope you don't misunderstand anything. I didn't have a choice but to come here to settle something at work, and I didn't expect to run into you here." Lucian gave her a sideways glance, and his tone sounded ambiguous as he continued, "I think it was the same last time I helped you out, but you didn't say or do anything in return. Instead, you treated me the same as those perverts, trying to put as much distance between us as possible." They stood very near each other, and it was unknown whose stench of alcohol was lingering between them. Roxan recalled the first time she had seen him at the hotel after she returned to the country, and she frowned at the memory. Although she refused to acknowledge it, she knew Lucian was telling the truth. "I didn't ask for your help." After a long moment, Roxan finally broke the silence, but her tone still sounded as distant as ever. Lucian frowned slightly at that, and displeasure filled the look in his eyes. "Is that so? If I didn't help you just now, how did you plan to get yourself out of that situation?" Roxan lowered her gaze. "I am a doctor. I'll come up with a way eventually." Having studied acupuncture for so many years, Roxan knew which acupuncture points could make someone instantly lose the energy to attack but not lethal enough to kill them. If the doctor dared to get any closer to her, Roxan would not hesitate to let him learn the brutal way about the gap between their medical knowledge. However, before she could make a move, Lucian had already appeared before them. Hearing that, Lucian immediately understood the implication behind her words. Back when Roxan was performing acupuncture on Alfred, Lucian had watched her from one side, so he was aware of just how knowledgeable she was with human acupuncture points. It was certainly enough to show that Roxan had the ability to defend herself. Thinking of this, Lucian could not help but feel more relieved. However, Lucian was still upset to see her indifferent expression toward him. "In that case, can I assume you're seeing me as a busybody meddling in your affairs, Miss Jarvis?" Roxan fell silent and continued staring at him. Despite her silence, her expression was enough to tell him the answer to his question. The first time Lucian was seen as nosy for helping someone out of kindness. "Regardless, I still helped you." Roxan did not want to waste more time on this conversation. She frowned and said sarcastically, "Thank you, Mr. Farwell, for helping me. I should really get going. Since you're here for business, I'm sure someone is waiting for you too. Shouldn't you return now?" With that, she nodded at him and was about to head back to her private room with her colleagues when he grabbed her wrist. Perhaps it was the alcohol, because Roxan felt that all of her emotions were magnified at that moment. She was suddenly triggered by his action. "What on earth are you doing? I've thanked you. What else do you want from me?" She snapped. 6 years ago, when she was still madly in love with him, he had hurt her so much. Yet now that she was determined to stay away from him and return to being strangers, he refused to leave her alone. Roxan could not read through his mind, and she was no longer interested in guessing his intentions. She wanted nothing but to stay away from him as far as possible. However, Lucian refused to let that happen. At the same time, Lucian had no idea what he was doing. When he regained his senses again, he noticed he had already grabbed her slender wrist. Taking in her furious expression, he knitted his brows. "Is that how you treat a person who has helped you? Why are you in such a hurry to return to your private room? Is there someone you care about a lot waiting for you?" Roxan found his accusation unreasonable. "What does that have to do with you? Let go of me." Despite her protest, Lucian exerted more strength into his grip instead. Roxanne was in pain and her expression changed a little. Sure enough, Lucian captured every change in her expression, but he did not soften his grasp around her wrist, and he took a step forward. Roxanne narrowed her eyes and tensed up at his sudden advancement. Lucian chuckled meaningfully. He exuded a suppressive aura as he stared at Roxanne. "Miss Jarvis, even if you think of me as a busybody and refuse to thank me for helping you, I still risked losing out on a business opportunity by keeping my client waiting for me for such a long time inside the private room. So, Miss Jarvis, is there any way you can think of to compensate me for my losses?" Roxanne frowned and met his gaze. She refused to believe there would be someone bold enough to refuse to seal a business deal with the Farwell family. This was only Lucian's excuse, and she was aware of that. However, since he had already voiced out about this, she refused to owe him anything. Roxanne lowered her gaze, recomposed herself, and suppressed her anger from earlier. When she looked up at him again, she gave him an indifferent look. "I don't know what I can offer to compensate you. I remember seeing a cafe that looks great when I walked around the area this afternoon. Mr. Farwell, what do you say if I buy you a cup of coffee?" "I'm okay with that." Then he slowly let go of her wrist. When he loosened his grip around her wrist, his fingers mindlessly grazed the soft skin on her wrist. Lucian's eyes darkened a little at the accidental touch, and when he let go of her, he subconsciously clenched his fist. The cafe Roxanne mentioned was located in the same building as the hotel, and it was the same cafe she saw by chance when they returned to the hotel after getting lost earlier in the afternoon. She did not invite Lucian to the cafe because it was unique from other eateries in the area, but because the cafe was the only location she could think of at that moment. They walked into the cafe together. Soon, a waitress came up to them. "Do you have a reservation?" Roxanne shook her head and glanced around. It was dinner time and the peak time for couples to date around in cafes. Thus, the place was almost packed when they arrived. Fortunately, the cafe occupied a large area but did not set up too many tables inside, giving the customers enough space and privacy from other tables and not to the extent of feeling uncomfortable. Right then, Roxanne spotted some customers leaving a table near the window, so she walked in that direction. The waitress quickly followed behind. Her eyes lit up as she watched them walk ahead of her. The cafe was considered high-end in Belridge, and the customers were mainly the rich and celebrities. The waitress had seen many customers while working in this cafe. However, it was her first time seeing a couple like Roxanne and Lucian with striking looks and a unique presence. After following them to the table near the window, the waitress had someone clear the table first before giving them a menu. Then, she recommended enthusiastically, "We have the latest couple set menu that is quite the crowd's favorite. Would you like to have that?" Hearing that, Roxanne and Lucian were startled. Lucian looked at Roxanne, who was sitting across from him, expectantly. He noticed that Roxanne had stopped flipping the menu for a brief moment. She looked at the waitress before smiling faintly. "No thanks. We're not a couple." After saying that, she lowered her head again and browsed the menu. In the end, she only ordered what she wanted and handed the menu to Lucian. "Mr. Farwell, order whatever you want. There's no need to be polite with me. I can still afford to buy you a cup of coffee." Lucian was still upset that she denied they were a couple to the waitress, so he did not respond to what she told him. Instead, he said to the waitress, "I'll have the same." The waitress nodded in response and walked away with the menu. She stood in the corner while sneaking glances at them sitting by the window. Although she denied being a couple with him, I must say their looks and vibes match each other so well. They're like the perfect match. Later, when she sent drinks to their table, the waitress looked calm on the surface, but she was losing her mind on the inside. "They look even better up close." Roxanne's makeup was light enough to enhance her delicate features. She looked so beautiful that the waitress thought she was a celebrity at first. Lucian, on the other hand, had sharp features and a tall build, and he exuded the aura of an authoritative CEO. The waitress could not help but picture them as a perfect match made in heaven. Of course, Roxanne was unaware of what the waitress was thinking about her and Lucian. She felt slightly unwell as the alcohol had finally started kicking in. Her reactions to alcohol always came slower than others. However, since she had asked Lucian out for a cup of coffee, she felt it was inappropriate for her to leave with the excuse of her feeling unwell. That would only give Lucian another reason to mock her. With this in mind, Roxanne suppressed the discomfort inside her and took a sip of her coffee, trying to cancel out the feeling of being drunk. Lucian took a sip of the coffee as he remained expressionless, masking the displeasure he was feeling. He wanted Roxanne to thank him or compensate him, not to sit in front of him without a word. Although I used the business going under as an excuse, does she really think a cup of coffee is enough to compensate me? Roxanne put down her cup and looked out the window. She had no intention of speaking at all. First, she believed there was nothing else they had to say to each other. Second, she didn't want to get too involved with him. The only reason she had treated him to the coffee was to call it even. She was starting to feel uncomfortable from the alcohol earlier. From time to time, she would lower her head to sip on the coffee while secretly checking how much Lucian had drunk. All she wanted was for him to finish the coffee so she could leave. However, Lucian's coffee stayed almost untouched even after some time. Left with no choice, Roxanne looked at him and asked, "Mr. Farwell, why aren't you drinking?" A dark glint flashed across Lucian's eyes as he pursed his lips enigmatically and said, "I don't like my coffee this way. It tastes bland." Roxanne frowned at his words. "How do you like your coffee then?" she questioned as she rubbed her throbbing temples. After she spoke, her head started spinning again. She closed her eyes and forced them open once again, trying to maintain eye contact with Lucian as though nothing was wrong. Lucian was just about to say something when he saw her expression. "Are you feeling unwell?" Roxanne bit her lip. "I drank a bit too much, but I'm all right. Just tell me how you want me to compensate you, Mr. Farwell. After all, you handle huge transactions, and I'm afraid you won't be satisfied with this compensation." Lucian's face darkened a bit when he took in her pale face and mocking words, but he said nothing in the end. Instead, he asked the waitress for the bill. Roxanne was going to argue that she was supposed to pay, but Lucian had swiped his card before she could do so. The waitress was the same person from earlier. From the way she looked at Roxanne, it seemed as though she was questioning why they denied being a couple when they were actually dating. When Roxanne met eyes with the waitress, she felt even more troubled. "Where are you staying?" "I'll drop you off there." Lucian walked to her side with a grim face, but his actions remained gentle. Without giving Roxanne the chance to reject him, he helped her to her feet. Right after Roxanne stood up, dizziness overcame her, causing her to miss the best opportunity to push him away. When she came back to her senses, Lucian had already brought her to the exit of the cafe. Almost everyone in the cafe was looking at them, and they could clearly see how he had his arms wrapped around her to support her. Roxanne felt extremely weak from her dizzy spell. With so many people watching them, she didn't want to make a scene. Thus, she went along with Lucian and allowed him to bring her into his car. Caden was already waiting in the driver's seat. When they got in, he asked, "Mr. Farwell, where to?" Lucian turned his head and looked at Roxanne. Still rubbing her temples, she said in a low voice, "There's no need to trouble yourselves. There are still many seniors waiting for me upstairs. I have to return." With that, she opened the car door to get out. Lucian grabbed her wrist swiftly and held her back. "Either I send you back or you rest at my hotel. Choose one. My hotel is just nearby." Roxanne knitted her brows and leaned back in the seat. Then she told Caden the name of the hotel she was staying at. Caden nodded and started the engine. "Drive slowly," reminded Lucian. Caden hurriedly nodded in acknowledgement. Throughout the journey, he made sure to drive carefully. Meanwhile, the two people in the back seat stayed silent. Thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed this story, please like and share so others can see it too. Also hit the subscription button and notification bell so you can be notified on our next release. Thank you for your support. God bless you.